No one ever looks twice at the overweight cleaning lady scrubbing the blood off the marble floors. They see a slow, invisible woman in a grey polyester uniform, a permanent fixture of the background. So when Jasmine Russo, the most ruthless syndicate head on the eastern seaboard, found himself shoved into his own biometric panic room and locked inside, he thought it was the ultimate betrayal. He slammed his bruised fists against the reinforced titanium, cursing the Heavyset Maid who had just sealed his coffin to save her own skin. But then, the hidden security monitors flickered to life, and Jasmine watched in stunned, breathless silence as the woman who ironed his shirts picked up a 10-inch meat cleaver, rolled up her sleeves, and turned his $40 million estate into a slaughterhouse. Beatrice Gallagher carried 240 pounds on a 5'5" frame, a physical reality that made her virtually invisible in the high-stakes, hyper-masculine world of the Russo crime syndicate. In a sprawling Hudson Valley estate populated by lean, muscular enforcers in tailored Italian suits and hollow-eyed models draping themselves over leather sofas, Beatrice was a ghost who happened to take up space. Her grey uniform was always impeccably pressed, her thick, greying blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, and her orthopedic, rubber-soled shoes squeaked a dull, rhythmic pattern against the imported travertine tiles. To Jasmine Russo, the 36-year-old undisputed boss of the organization, she was simply Bae. She was a utility, no different from the sub-zero refrigerator in the kitchen or the silent HVAC system that kept the mansion at a crisp 68 degrees. She dusted his imported mahogany bookshelves. She emptied the heavy crystal ashtrays left behind by his underboss, Leo Cavallo. She knew exactly how to scrub the stubborn stains of cordite and dried blood from the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni shirts without asking a single question. It was a Tuesday night, raining sideways against the floor-to-ceiling ballistic glass of the estate's west wing. The house was unusually quiet. Joanna Pendleton, the head of Jasmine's personal security detail, had scaled down the interior guard presence for a private sit-down Jasmine was supposed to have with a few capos later that evening. Joanna, a former Delta operator with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, had always treated Beatrice with outright disdain. He would purposefully track mud onto the freshly mopped foyer, just to watch her heave her weight down onto her knees to clean it again. Beatrice never complained. She would just retrieve her bucket, her breathing heavy but steady, and do her job. Jasmine was sitting in his cavernous study, nursing a glass of 20-year-old Macallan. The dim glow of the fireplace cast long, flickering shadows across his sharp jawline and the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. He was reviewing shipping manifests from the port of Newark, calculating the losses from a recent raid by the feds. In the corner of the room, near the antique globe, Beatrice was methodically polishing the brass trimmings of a display case. The only sound in the room was the soft shh, shh of her microfiber cloth and the crackle of the burning oak. Jasmine didn't even register her presence. She was just part of the furniture. He didn't notice the way her pale blue eyes occasionally darted toward the windows, tracking the rhythm of the storm outside. He didn't notice that, despite her heavy frame, she moved with an odd, fluid economy of motion, never bumping into tables, never knocking over the fragile artifacts that littered the room. And he certainly didn't notice the way she suddenly stopped polishing, her head tilting slightly to the left, like a hound catching a scent on the wind. It was 11:42 p.m. The first sign that something was horribly wrong wasn't an explosion or a gunshot. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The ambient hum of the estate's central server down the hall abruptly cut out. Jasmine frowned, looking up from his papers. "Joanna," he called out, reaching for the radio on his desk. Static hissed back at him. "Joanna, the backup generators better kick in within 10 seconds. Jasmine snapped, his voice tight with the innate paranoia that kept men in his profession alive. From the corner of the room, Beatrice's voice broke the silence. It was the first time Jasmine had heard her speak more than 2 words in 3 years. Her voice was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of panic. "They won't, Mr. Russo. The localized EMP tripped the primary circuits, and they've already severed the hard lines to the diesel backups." Jasmine froze, staring at the overweight Maid. She had dropped her polishing cloth. She was reaching down, hiking up the skirt of her heavy grey uniform. Strapped to her thick thigh was a matte black suppressed Heckler and Coke USP tactical pistol. "What the hell are you?" Jasmine started to stand, reaching for the revolver hidden under his desk. Before his fingers could brush the steel, the reinforced mahogany doors of the study violently buckled inward. The heavy doors groaned under the force of a shaped breaching charge, then exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal hinges. The concussive wave threw Jasmine backward over his leather chair. His head cracked against the corner of the bookshelf, his vision swimming in a haze of sudden pain and ringing tinnitus. Through the smoke, 3 figures stepped into the study. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. Tactical black gear, quad-lens night vision goggles, and suppressed short-barreled rifles. This wasn't a rival Mafia hit squad looking for a messy drive-by. These were Tier 1 mercenaries. Jasmine recognized the insignia of the Blackwood Syndicate, a private military contracting firm that operated exclusively on the dark web, renowned for untraceable assassinations. Someone had paid a king's ransom to see him dead tonight. Jasmine scrambled backward, his hand desperately grabbing for his ankle holster, but his fingers were numb from the blast. One of the mercenaries raised his rifle, the red laser sight painting a neat dot directly over Jasmine's heart. A heavy, sickening thud echoed through the room. The mercenary's head snapped violently to the side. A heavy brass bookend, weighing nearly 10 pounds, had caught him perfectly in the temple, thrown with the velocity of a major league fastball. He crumpled to the floor instantly. The other 2 operators pivoted, their lasers cutting through the smoke, searching for the threat. They weren't expecting a 240-pound woman. Beatrice hit the second mercenary like a runaway freight train. She didn't use martial arts. She used pure, unadulterated mass and momentum. She drove her heavy shoulder directly into the man's sternum. The impact sounded like a car crash. The man was thrown off his feet, his ribs visibly caving in as he crashed through the glass display case. The third operator leveled his weapon at her, but Beatrice was already moving. For a woman of her size, her speed was a terrifying anomaly. She grabbed the barrel of the rifle, forcing it upward as it fired a suppressed burst into the ceiling. With her other hand, she drove the heel of her palm upward, crushing the cartilage of the man's nose upward into his brain pan. He dropped like a stone. Jasmine watched, paralyzed, bleeding from his temple. His brain completely failed to process the physics of what he had just witnessed. His maid, the woman who baked lemon pound cake for the staff on Sundays, had just neutralized 3 elite operators in less than 6 seconds. Beatrice didn't pause to admire her work. She turned to Jasmine, her face a mask of terrifying calm. "Get up! B! What are you—" She crossed the room in 3 heavy strides, grabbing Jasmine by the collar of his expensive suit and hauling him to his feet with shocking, effortless strength. There are 12 more entering through the conservatory. Joanna is dead. Your security detail is compromised. We have 40 seconds before the secondary sweep team breaches this floor. She dragged him toward the massive stone fireplace at the back of the study. Jasmine stumbled, his equilibrium shot. Behind the fireplace was his panic room, a state-of-the-art titanium vault lined with lead and independent air scrubbers. Only he and his missing consigliere, Leo, knew the biometric sequence to open it. Beatrice shoved Jasmine against the stone mantel. She ripped a heavy iron poker from the fireplace stand and jammed it into a microscopic crevice in the mortar, twisting it sharply. A hidden panel popped open, revealing a keypad. Jasmine gasped for air. You know about this?" Beatrice ignored him. Her thick fingers flew across the keypad in a blur, punching in the 8-digit alphanumeric override code that Jasmine changed weekly. A code he had never written down. The massive stone fireplace hummed, then slid to the side with a heavy metallic grinding noise, revealing the gleaming steel of the vault door. The door hissed open. "Get in!" Beatrice commanded, shoving him roughly toward the entrance. "Wait!" Jasmine panicked, planting his feet. If she knew the code, if she was this capable, she had to be a plant, a mole. "You're with them. You're locking me in so they can cut through the vents." Beatrice looked at him. For the first time, Jasmine saw the eyes of a predator. Cold, calculating, and deeply irritated. "If I wanted you dead, Jasmine, I would have let them shoot you. Get in the box." Before he could argue, she placed both of her hands on his chest and shoved. The sheer kinetic force of the push lifted him off his feet, sending him tumbling backward into the brightly lit panic room. He crashed onto the emergency cot inside. "Wait! B!" Jasmine yelled, scrambling to his knees, but she was already closing the heavy vault door. "Stay quiet, don't touch the comms." The heavy titanium slab slammed shut, the locking mechanisms engaging with a series of loud, heavy thunks. Jasmine rushed the door, slamming his fists against the cold metal. "Open the door! Gallagher, open this damned door!" he roared. He was locked in. He was entirely at her mercy. He backed away, running his hands through his dark hair, his chest heaving. He had been betrayed. He was blind and deaf in a steel coffin while mercenaries roamed his home. Then a green light blinked on the control console embedded in the wall. System override. Internal monitors active. Beatrice hadn't shut the system down. She had powered up the internal closed-circuit television grid for him. Jasmine staggered to the console and tapped the touch screen. Instantly, a grid of 16 high-definition, infrared-capable camera feeds illuminated the dark panic room. He had full visibility of his entire estate. The study, the grand hallways, the subterranean kitchens, the wine cellar. He found the feed for his study. The room was empty, save for the 3 dead or unconscious mercenaries on the floor. Beatrice was gone. Jasmine leaned heavily against the console, his eyes darting across the screens, searching for the grey uniform of his traitorous maid. He found her on camera 7. She was walking down the dimly lit service corridor, leading to the industrial kitchen. Jasmine watched, mesmerized and horrified, waiting for her to open the back doors and let the rest of the hit squad inside. He waited for her to point them toward his vault. Instead, he watched Beatrice Gallagher stop in the middle of the hallway. She reached behind her back and unfastened the tight, restrictive apron of her uniform, letting it drop to the floor. She rolled up the sleeves of her grey dress, exposing thick, muscular forearms corded with veins and scarred with old, faded burns. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked into the kitchen, picked up a massive, carbon steel meat cleaver from the magnetic block, and waited in the shadows. She was going to hunt them. Jasmine stared at the monitors, the silence of the panic room ringing in his ears, broken only by his own heavy breathing. On the screens, the brutal reality of the invasion unfolded in silent, high-definition terror. On camera 2, the main foyer, a squad of 4 Blackwood mercenaries moved in tight tactical formation. They stepped over the body of Joanna Pendleton, who lay in a growing pool of dark blood near the front doors. They were communicating via hand signals, sweeping the rooms methodically. On camera 7, Beatrice stood perfectly still in the cavernous, stainless steel industrial kitchen. The emergency lighting cast long, ominous shadows across her wide frame. She held the heavy meat cleaver loosely in her right hand. In her left, she had picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet, gripping it by the handle like a buckler shield. She looked absurd. A fat, middle-aged woman in a maid's dress, standing in a kitchen with cooking utensils. But having felt the crushing power of her shoulder, Jasmine wasn't laughing. The radio comms from the mercenaries must have alerted the others that the study team had gone dark. The feed on camera 4 showed 2 operators detaching from the main group and heading down the service corridor toward the kitchen, their rifles raised. "Run, B," Jasmine thought, his hands gripping the edge of the console. "You're a heavy woman. You can't outmaneuver them in an open room. Hide in the pantry." Beatrice didn't hide. She understood her physical limitations perfectly. She wasn't an acrobat. She couldn't perform jumping roundhouse kicks or slide across the floor, but what she lacked in agility, she made up for in geometry, leverage, and bone-crushing mass. She moved toward the double-swinging doors of the kitchen and pressed her wide back against the wall, right beside the hinges. She reached out and deliberately knocked a stack of metal mixing bowls off the prep counter. They crashed to the floor, a deafening clatter in the silent house. On the corridor feed, the 2 mercenaries snapped their muzzles toward the kitchen doors. They stacked up, one behind the other. The lead man pushed the right side door open slowly with the barrel of his rifle, sweeping the room. Because Beatrice was pressed flat against the wall on the hinge side, the opening door perfectly concealed her. The lead mercenary stepped into the kitchen, his eyes glued to the optical sight of his rifle, scanning the fallen bowls. The second man followed, stepping through the doorway. Beatrice moved. She didn't swing the cleaver first, she used the environment. With a violent thrust of her thick legs, she slammed her entire body weight against the heavy wooden swinging door. The door swung back with terrifying velocity, catching the second mercenary squarely in the back and crushing him between the heavy door and the doorframe. The sickening crunch of his collarbone snapping was almost visible on the screen. He screamed, dropping his weapon. The lead mercenary spun around at the noise. Beatrice was already there. She closed the distance in 2 heavy, thundering steps. The man tried to bring his rifle up, but Beatrice slammed the cast-iron skillet down onto the barrel, pinning the weapon downward with her immense strength. The man reached for a combat knife at his belt, but Beatrice didn't give him the time. She drove her heavy knee upward, catching him in the groin with enough force to lift him onto his toes. As his head snapped forward in agony, she brought the meat cleaver down. Jasmine flinched, turning his head away from the screen for a fraction of a second. When he looked back, the mercenary was on the floor, bleeding out rapidly from a massive, devastating wound to the side of his neck. The second man, whose collarbone was broken, had managed to draw a sidearm. He fired wildly from the floor. One bullet grazed Beatrice's thick upper arm, tearing through the grey polyester. She didn't even wince. She didn't scream. The expression on her wide face remained one of mild, clinical annoyance. She stepped heavily onto the man's wrist, pinning the gun to the floor beneath her orthopedic shoe. She leaned her weight forward, and the joint audibly popped under her mass. The man shrieked. Beatrice bent down, grabbed him by the tactical vest, and effortlessly dragged his writhing body toward the massive, walk-in commercial freezer. She punched the button to open the heavy insulated door, threw him inside like a sack of potatoes, and slammed it shut, engaging the exterior padlock. Jasmine exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He touched his own face, feeling the cold sweat on his forehead. This was impossible. The raw, brutal efficiency. The complete lack of hesitation. She fought like someone who had spent a lifetime studying the anatomy of pain. Who the hell was Beatrice Gallagher? He watched her on the monitor. She paused by the sink to inspect the bullet graze on her arm. She calmly reached into a first aid kit on the wall, grabbed a bottle of surgical glue, and squirted it directly into the bleeding wound, sealing it shut. She didn't bat an eye. Then, she picked up the suppressed MP7 rifle dropped by the first mercenary. She checked the magazine, chambered a round, and adjusted the stock to fit against her heavy shoulder. She looked up, staring directly into the lens of camera 7. Through the grainy, infrared feed, Jasmine felt her eyes bore into his soul. It was a look of absolute authority, a silent command. Watch the master at work. Jasmine's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The cold dread of betrayal he had felt just moments ago was rapidly morphing into something else. Something dark, primal, and deeply intoxicating. He was a man who respected power above all else. He had spent his life surrounding himself with dangerous men, killers and thugs. But he had never seen anything like the sheer, terrifying majesty of the woman currently turning his kitchen into an abattoir. On camera 2, the remaining squad of assassins was converging on the kitchen, alerted by the gunfire. Silas Cobb, the leader of the hit squad, signaled his men to fan out. They were moving in for the kill. In the kitchen, Beatrice wiped the blood off the handle of her cleaver, gripped the stolen rifle, and waited in the dark. The invisible woman was finally making herself known, and Jasmine Rousseau, locked safely in his titanium cage, couldn't look away. The monitors in the panic room glowed with the cold green tint of infrared. Jasmine Rousseau stood inches from the glass screens, his breathing shallow, his expensive Italian suit jacket discarded on the floor. He was watching a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, orchestrated by a 240-pound woman who usually smelled of lemon pledge and lavender fabric softener. Silas Cobb, the veteran commander of the Blackwood Syndicate strike team, was rapidly losing control of the perimeter. On camera 3, which covered the grand foyer and the sprawling mahogany staircase, Jasmine watched Cobb frantically signaling his remaining men. They were heavily armed, wearing level 4 ceramic plates and carrying suppressed Sig Sauer MCX rifles, weapons favored by elite real-world units like the British SAS and the CIA's ground branch. But all their cutting-edge gear was useless against an enemy who knew every squeaking floorboard, every blind spot, and every structural weakness of the $40 million estate. Beatrice had not stayed in the kitchen. She understood that static defense was a death sentence against superior numbers. Instead, she had moved into the subterranean wine cellar, a maze of floor-to-ceiling French oak racks holding thousands of vintage bottles. Through camera 9, Jasmine watched her thick, powerful silhouette move through the narrow aisles. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving against the torn fabric of her grey uniform, but her hands were rock steady. She had discarded the MP7. Its 4.6mm rounds lacked the stopping power she needed against heavily armored targets. Instead, she had acquired a Benelli M4 tactical shotgun from one of the downed guards, a heavy, brutal weapon that most shooters struggled to control under rapid fire. For Beatrice, the weapon was a toy. Her immense physical mass acted as a natural shock absorber. Jasmine watched, his pulse hammering in his throat as she systematically prepared her kill box. She didn't hide. She deliberately dragged a heavy, iron wine-tasting table across the stone floor, the screech of metal echoing up the stairwell to lure them in. She managed sightlines. She shot out 3 of the 4 overhead bulbs with a suppressed pistol, plunging the cellar into deep, confusing shadows. She used her environment. She wedged her thick shoulder against a load-bearing rack near the choke point of the stairs, turning herself into an immovable object. "They're taking the bait, B," Jasmine whispered to the empty panic room, his palms pressed flat against the console. He was entirely captivated. The sheer, unapologetic bulk of her, which he had once dismissed as a sign of laziness or poor health, was actually her greatest tactical advantage. She possessed the kinetic energy of a wrecking ball. On camera 8, 3 of Cobb's men descended the spiral stone stairs into the cellar, their night vision goggles down. They moved in a tight wedge, sweeping their rifles. Beatrice waited until the point man stepped off the last stair. She didn't aim for center mass. She knew their ceramic plates would absorb the buckshot. Instead, she stepped out from behind the heavy oak rack, her wide stance perfectly balanced, and fired at the stone ceiling directly above them. The concussive roar of the 12-gauge in the enclosed stone cellar was deafening, even muted through the monitors. But it wasn't the sound that killed them. The heavy slug shattered the ancient masonry and the wrought-iron chandelier anchoring the rack above. Hundreds of pounds of jagged stone, iron, and hundreds of glass wine bottles collapsed directly onto the squad. The 2 men in the rear were crushed instantly beneath the avalanche of debris and vintage Bordeaux. The point man, caught on the edge of the collapse, stumbled forward, his leg pinned. He desperately raised his rifle toward Beatrice. She didn't flinch. Moving with that same terrifying fluid economy, she closed the distance. She brought the heavy buttstock of the Benelli down in a savage, sweeping arc, connecting with the side of the mercenary's helmet. The reinforced polymer cracked under the sheer weight of her swing. The man went limp. Jasmine let out a harsh, ragged breath. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, leaving a streak of dried blood from his temple. He had spent his entire life commanding ruthless men. He had ordered hits, negotiated with cartels, and stared down federal prosecutors without blinking. But watching Beatrice Gallagher heave a breath, calmly eject a spent shell, and wipe a splash of red wine, or perhaps blood, from her cheek, he felt a visceral, electric jolt of pure attraction. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a bystander. She was a goddamn apex predator. And she was his. Upstairs, the silence was tearing Silas Cobb apart. He had entered the Russo estate with 12 top-tier operators. He was now down to 5, and they hadn't even scratched the paint on the titanium panic room. Jasmine watched Cobb on the study monitor. The mercenary ripped off his night vision goggles, his face pale and slick with sweat. He grabbed his radio. "Team 2. Sit rep." Cobb hissed. "Garrett, report." Static. Cobb kicked a mahogany chair across the room, splintering it against the wall. "Burn it down," he barked to his remaining men. "Forget the quiet infiltration. Grab the incendiaries. If we can't crack the vault, we'll cook Russo alive inside it. Sweep the halls, shoot anything that moves, and start lighting the drapes." In the panic room, Jasmine's blood ran cold. The vault had independent air scrubbers, but it wasn't rated to withstand a prolonged, structural fire. If the mansion collapsed on top of him, he would be buried alive in a superheated oven. He frantically searched the camera grid for Beatrice. He found her on camera 12, limping slightly as she made her way up the servants' stairwell to the second floor. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the sheer physical toll of moving her heavy frame at maximum output was starting to show. Her grey dress was soaked in sweat and grime. She doesn't know about the fire, Jasmine realized with a jolt of panic. He looked at the control console. There was an internal PA system designed for the head of security to issue estate-wide commands. If he used it, he would give away her position to the mercenaries. But if he didn't, she would walk right into a wall of thermite. Jasmine made a split-second decision. He toggled a specific switch, activating only the localized speaker in the second-floor servants' corridor. He leaned into the microphone. "B." On the monitor, Beatrice stopped dead in her tracks. Her head snapped up, her pale blue eyes scanning the ceiling until they locked onto the hidden camera lens. "It's Jasmine," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the haughty arrogance of a Mafia boss and replacing it with the urgent, intimate tone of a partner. "They're abandoning the extraction. Cobb is ordering them to burn the house down with incendiaries. They have thermite charges. You need to get out. Take the service elevator to the garage and take one of the armored SUVs. Leave me." Beatrice stared at the camera for a long, agonizing second. Her chest heaved. She reached up and pulled the pins out of her severe bun, letting her thick, graying blonde hair fall loose around her wide shoulders. She looked exhausted, battered, and utterly magnificent. She didn't speak. Instead, she raised her thick, calloused right hand to the camera lens and tapped out a rapid sequence on her thigh. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Jasmine's breath hitched. It was a tactical hand signal. Negative. Hold position. Before Jasmine could argue, the heavy oak doors at the end of her corridor blew open. Two of Cobb's men, armed with incendiary launchers, stepped into the hallway. "Contact!" one of them shouted, raising his weapon at the heavy-set woman at the other end of the hall. Beatrice didn't have cover. She didn't have the speed to outrun a thermite grenade, so she charged. It was a terrifying display of momentum. 240 pounds of pure, unstoppable forward motion. She fired the Benelli from the hip as she ran, the heavy recoil barely slowing her down. The first slug caught the lead mercenary in the shoulder joint, spinning him violently into the wall and sending his incendiary shot wild. It hit the ceiling, showering the corridor in blinding, white-hot sparks. The second mercenary, a hulking brute Cobb had called Garrett, dropped his launcher and drew a massive combat knife, bracing for the impact. He expected her to try and tackle him. He expected a clumsy, amateur grapple. Beatrice dropped the empty shotgun an inch before impact and dropped her center of gravity. She ducked entirely under his wild knife swing, driving her thick, powerful shoulder directly into his lead kneecap. The joint inverted with a sound like a snapping tree branch. Garrett roared in agony, collapsing downward. As his face came down to her level, Beatrice grabbed him by the tactical vest with both hands, using his own downward momentum to heave his 200-pound frame entirely over her wide back. She flipped him violently onto the hardwood floor. Before he could recover, she drove her heavy, orthopedic heel directly into his throat, crushing his windpipe instantly. She stood over him in the shower of white-hot sparks, panting heavily, her blue eyes blazing with a terrifying primal fury. The collar of her uniform had been torn completely open in the scuffle. In the panic room, Jasmine zoomed the camera feed in on her neck. His heart stopped. There, tattooed at the base of her thick neck, just above her collarbone, was a small, faded black ink symbol, a double-barred cross intertwined with a coiled viper. Jasmine staggered back from the console, his mind racing through decades of syndicate lore, CIA ghost stories, and black market whispers. The symbol belonged to a defunct, highly classified wet-work division of the CIA's Special Activities Center, a unit that officially didn't exist. And suddenly, a name he had heard, whispered by terrified Russian oligarchs 10 years ago, echoed in his mind. The matron, an operative who used her unassuming, matronly physique to bypass the highest security in the world, getting close enough to targets to tear them apart with her bare hands. She had supposedly died in a catastrophic explosion in Grozny in 2018. Jasmine looked at the blood-soaked, heavy-set woman on the screen, breathing hard amidst the sparks and the dead men. She wasn't just a maid. She was a legend, and she was currently ripping her way through a mercenary squad to protect him. Jasmine slammed his fist down on the console, a fierce, predatory grin spreading across his bruised face. "All right, Bear," he murmured, his voice practically vibrating with newfound reverence. "Let's hunt." Jasmine Russo didn't just watch anymore. He became her Overwatch, the biometric panic room, designed to be a passive coffin for a frightened billionaire, was suddenly transformed into a tactical command center. Through the encrypted PA system, Jasmine isolated the audio feed to the second-floor master suite. "B," his voice crackled through the hidden speakers, low and steady. "Cobb is pulling his last 2 men back to the grand foyer. They're abandoning the sweep. They have thermite charges, and they are going to blow the main structural pillars to bring the roof down on the vault. You have 90 seconds before they plant the detonators." On the monitor, Beatrice, or the woman Jasmine now suspected, was the legendary operative known as the matron, paused mid-stride. Her heavy chest heaved, the torn grey polyester of her uniform stained with soot, sweat, and the blood of 5 elite Blackwood contractors. She looked up at the camera hidden in the smoke detector. She didn't nod. She just adjusted her grip on the heavy Benelli shotgun and began to move. Her heavy orthopedic shoes pounded against the imported Persian runners. She wasn't built for a marathon, but for a short, explosive sprint. She possessed the terrifying, thundering momentum of a rhinoceros. "They have covering fire on the main staircase," Jasmine warned, his fingers flying across the touch screens, pulling up the blueprints of his own home. He was a Mafia boss who meticulously planned every assassination his syndicate carried out. Now, he was feeding tactical telemetry to a 240-pound wet-work legend. "Do not take the stairs, B. They'll chew you to pieces with 5.56 rounds." Beatrice didn't take the stairs. She veered sharply to the left, crashing her heavy shoulder through the locked double doors of Jasmine's private gymnasium. Jasmine watched on camera 15. The gym overlooked the grand foyer. The interior wall was made of floor-to-ceiling, reinforced smart glass. Below her, in the cavernous marble entryway, Silas Cobb and his 2 remaining men were hurriedly slapping grey bricks of military-grade thermite onto the marble columns. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She dropped the empty shotgun, grabbed a 40-pound cast-iron kettlebell from the rack, and walked toward the glass. "B, that glass is rated for small arms," Jasmine said over the gym's speaker, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "It won't break." Beatrice looked at the camera, her expression grim, and tapped the glass with her bloody knuckles. "Drop it," she mouthed. Jasmine's breath hitched. She wanted him to disengage the electromagnetic locks that held the massive glass panes in their reinforced frames. It was a maintenance override. If he did that, the pane would be loose, held only by friction. A dark, feral smile spread across Jasmine's face. He was falling in love with a monster. He punched in his master override code. "Electromagnets disengaged. Give 'em hell, sweetheart." Beatrice took 3 heavy steps back. She gripped the 40-pound kettlebell with both hands, let out a deep, guttural roar that echoed over the open comms, and charged. She didn't just throw the weight. She used her entire 240-pound frame, pivoting her thick hips and driving the iron sphere forward like an Olympic hammer thrower, right as her shoulder slammed into the loose pane of smart glass. The physics were catastrophic. The massive 1,000-pound pane of glass dislodged entirely from its frame, shattering outward under the kinetic bombardment of the kettlebell and her sheer mass. Down in the foyer, Silas Cobb looked up just in time to see a waterfall of jagged, reinforced glass and a 40-pound block of solid iron descending from the second floor. The kettlebell struck the mercenary on the left, directly in the chest cavity, caving in his ceramic plates and his sternum with a sickening crunch. He was dead before he hit the marble. The shower of heavy, razor-sharp glass incapacitated the second man, slicing through his tactical gear and severing his brachial artery. He collapsed, screaming, clutching his arm. Silas Cobb, a veteran of countless black ops from Fallujah to Bogotá, threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding the lethal downpour. He rolled up to his knees, raising his suppressed Sig Sauer MCX toward the ruined balcony. But Beatrice wasn't on the balcony. She had ridden the falling pane of glass down like a deranged surfer, using the chaotic avalanche of debris to mask her descent. She landed heavily on the marble floor, the impact sending a shockwave through her thick legs. Most people would have shattered their ankles. Beatrice's dense, heavy frame absorbed the drop with a brutal, groaning flex of her knees. Cobb fired. 3 rounds tore through the thick, fleshy part of Beatrice's left thigh. She grunted, a harsh, animalistic sound, but her forward momentum didn't stop. Because of her size, the 5.56mm rounds hadn't hit the femur. They had punched straight through the heavy adipose tissue and muscle, painful, bleeding heavily, but not structurally compromising. Before Cobb could adjust his aim for her head, Beatrice was on him. She tackled him, her 240 pounds hitting his chest like a dropped safe. Cobb's breath left his lungs in a violent rush as they crashed to the blood-slicked marble. He dropped his rifle, desperately drawing a serrated combat knife from his hip. He drove it upward, aiming for her ribs. Beatrice didn't try to block it. She simply shifted her massive weight, allowing the knife to bury itself into the thick padding of her waist, absorbing the blade away from her vital organs. Cobb's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he realized his fatal mistake. His arm was now pinned beneath her heavy torso, the knife stuck in her flesh. She grabbed him by the throat with one massive, calloused hand. Her grip was like an industrial vice. She leaned her entire body weight forward, pressing down. Cobb thrashed, his combat boots kicking wildly against the floor, but he couldn't move her. She was a mountain of flesh and muscle. She stared down at him, her pale blue eyes entirely devoid of mercy, and squeezed. The sickening wet pop of Cobb's trachea, collapsing, echoed through the empty foyer. He spasmed once, twice, and went entirely limp. The sudden, absolute silence that descended upon the Russo estate was heavier than the gunfire had been. The concussive echoes of the Benelli shotgun and the sharp, terrifying crack of snapping bone faded, leaving only the relentless, drumming rhythm of the Hudson Valley rain lashing against the unbroken ballistic windows. Inside the biometric panic room, Jasmine Russo stood frozen, his palms flat against the cool metal of the control console. His chest heaved as the adrenaline spiked and crashed through his veins. He stared at the high-definition monitor displaying the grand foyer. Silas Cobb, the veteran commander of a multi-million-dollar Black Ops strike team, lay motionless on the shattered marble, his throat crushed by the bare hands of a woman who, just 3 hours ago, had been quietly dusting Jasmine's mahogany bookshelves. Jasmine didn't wait for the estate's secondary diesel generators to kick in. He stepped away from the monitors and slammed his palm onto the manual biometric release pad. The heavy titanium vault door hissed, the complex internal locking mechanisms grinding as it slid open, breaking the hermetic seal. The air outside the vault was thick and acrid, a choking mixture of vaporized copper, burnt cordite, and the sharp chemical tang of discharged thermite. Jasmine stepped out of his sanctuary and into the ruined shell of his study. He stepped carefully over the 3 bodies on his Persian rug, his bespoke Italian leather shoes, crunching softly over splintered wood and spent brass casings. He walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward the grand foyer. The destruction was apocalyptic. The walls were pockmarked with 5.56mm bullet holes. Antique vases were reduced to powdered porcelain, and the air was hazy with grey dust. He found her sitting heavily on the bottom step of the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase. Beatrice, or whoever she truly was, had pulled the serrated combat knife from the thick flesh of her waist. She had tossed the bloody blade onto the floor and was currently using a torn, soot-stained strip of her grey polyester uniform to bind the gunshot wounds on her massive left thigh. She didn't flinch. She didn't weep. Her face was a mask of cold, clinical exhaustion. Her wide shoulders slumped as she pulled the makeshift tourniquet tight with her teeth and one thick, calloused hand. She didn't look up as Jasmine approached, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "The local police won't come," Jasmine said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant baritone that cut through the silence. "Captain Thomas Miller of the precinct is on my payroll. He's already established a 5-mile perimeter under the guise of a downed power line. My personal cleanup crew will be here in 20 minutes with the vans." The heavy-set woman finished tying the knot on her thigh. She let her head fall back against the polished wooden banister, her pale blue eyes finally drifting up to meet his. She looked battered, soaked in sweat and blood, her grey hair falling in matted, greying blonde waves around her wide face. "They'll need industrial bleach for the subterranean wine cellar," she muttered, her voice gravelly, lacking entirely the deferential meekness he had ignored for 3 years. "It's a structural mess down there, and you're out of the 98 Bordeaux." Jasmine let out a low, dark chuckle. The sound startled him. He hadn't laughed in months, not truly. He slowly crouched down, ignoring the pooling blood that immediately began to soak into the knees of his expensive suit trousers. He positioned himself perfectly eye-level with her. Up close, he could see the intricate web of faded white scars that crossed her thick forearms and disappeared beneath the ruined collar of her uniform. And there, at the base of her thick neck, just above the collarbone, was the faded black ink he had spotted on the monitors. A double-barred cross, intertwined with a coiled viper. "You're not Beatrice Gallagher," Jasmine stated softly, his dark eyes tracing the ink. "And you certainly aren't a maid. Gideon Hayes ran a ghost unit out of Langley 10 years ago, the Special Activities Center's Deep Cover Division. They had an operative, a woman whose physical profile made her entirely invisible to high-level security, because the world is trained to look right through fat, middle-aged women." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze locked onto hers. "They called her the matron." She stared back at him, her face completely impassive, though a flicker of cold respect crossed her eyes. "Margaret Donovan," she corrected quietly, the name tasting foreign after so long. "And I retired, Jasmine, explosively, in Grozny." "Then why are you here, Margaret?" Jasmine asked, the question burning in his chest. "If Alistair Sterling, or the Blackwood Syndicate, hired you to kill me, I would have been dead 3 years ago when you first started ironing my shirts." Margaret let out a long, ragged sigh, the immense weight of her chest rising and falling. "I wasn't sent to kill you. I was hired to keep you breathing." Jasmine frowned, his mind racing through the limited list of people who possessed that kind of capital and that kind of foresight. "By who?" "Leo Cavallo," she said. Jasmine froze. The air in his lungs suddenly turned to ice. Leo was his consigliere, his mentor, the man who had vanished without a trace 3 weeks ago. Jasmine had spent every waking hour assuming Leo had finally betrayed him, sold him out to the feds, or defected to the Chicago outfit. Leo found out Alistair Sterling was quietly putting a $40 million contract on your head on the dark web, Margaret explained, her voice softening just a fraction. "He knew your standard security team, even an ex-operator like Joanna, wasn't equipped to handle a prolonged siege by Blackwood contractors. They were too loud, too visible. So Leo found me through some very old, very dark channels. He paid me a fortune to assume the identity of Beatrice Gallagher and embed myself in your house. I was supposed to be your final, invisible insurance policy." "And Leo?" Jasmine asked, his chest tightening painfully, the guilt of his suspicions threatening to choke him. Sterling caught wind that Leo was digging into the dark web contract. Margaret said softly, her blue eyes never leaving his. "They intercepted him at the Brooklyn docks 3 weeks ago. They tortured him for days, Jasmine. They tried to get the biometric vault codes, the layout of this estate, the guard rotations. He knew I was here, waiting in the background, but he never broke. He died before he could warn you about the strike team." Jasmine closed his eyes. A wave of profound grief, hot and acidic, washed over him, immediately followed by a terrifying, cold rage. Leo had been loyal to the very end. He had bought Jasmine his life, paying the ultimate price to ensure this woman remained hidden in plain sight. Jasmine opened his eyes and looked at the heavy, blood-soaked woman sitting on his ruined stairs. She had spent 3 years scrubbing his marble floors. She had endured Joanna's petty, cruel abuse. She had lived as a ghost in a scratchy polyester dress, baking lemon pound cake for men who didn't even know her last name, all to honor a contract with a dead man. He reached out. His hand was entirely steady as he gently brushed a thick streak of soot and drying blood from her cheek. Margaret flinched slightly at the contact. She was a creature used to violence, entirely unused to gentleness, but she didn't pull away. "The contract is fulfilled, Margaret," Jasmine said, his voice thrumming with a dark, absolute certainty. "Leo paid you to save my life. You did. You took down a Tier 1 strike team with kitchen utensils and sheer kinetic force. You are a very wealthy woman, and you are entirely free to walk out of those doors and disappear back into the ghosts." He leaned closer, the space between them evaporating. The scent of his expensive cedar wood cologne mixed heavily with the metallic tang of her blood and the sweat of her exertion. "Or you can stay." Margaret raised a thick eyebrow, a flicker of cynical, defensive amusement cutting through her exhaustion. "Stay? As what, Jasmine? Your maid? I think I've broken all your good china. And I'm fairly certain I destroyed the industrial freezer." "No," Jasmine said, his gaze intensely focused. He was stripping away the invisibility she had worn like armor for 3 years. He didn't see a heavy-set cleaning lady. He saw the apex predator beneath the flesh. He saw the architectural genius of her violence. He saw a queen capable of ruling his vicious, unforgiving empire by his side. Not my maid, my partner, my equal. He let his hand slide down from her cheek, his thumb resting gently against the pulse point of her thick neck, right over the viper tattoo. "You possess a brutality that absolutely terrifies me, Margaret. You are a force of nature. And in my world, in the life I lead, that is the highest form of intimacy." Margaret looked at him, searching his dark, handsome face for mockery, for pity, or for deceit. She found absolutely none. She found only a ravenous, unapologetic admiration. For the first time in her entire life, a man wasn't looking past her weight or dismissing her because of her plainness. He was looking directly at the terrifying, capable monster she truly was, and instead of running, he was offering her a throne. She let out a slow, breathy laugh, her heavy shoulders shaking, the sound echoing in the ruined hall. She looked around at the carnage, the blood on the marble, the bodies of elite killers broken by her hands. She had been hiding for so long. It felt incredibly good to be seen. "I'm going to need an entirely new wardrobe," Margaret murmured, her lips curling into a dangerous, bloody smiles that made Jasmine's heart hammer against his ribs. "Grey really isn't my color anymore." Jasmine smiled back, a feral flash of white teeth in the gloom of the shattered foyer. "Margaret, I'll buy you the whole damn city." No one ever looks twice at the heavy-set woman in the background. It is a fatal flaw of human perception, born of vanity and arrogance, and it cost the Blackwood Syndicate everything. Jasmine Rousseau learned that night that true power doesn't always come in a tailored suit or a lean, athletic frame. Sometimes the most lethal force in the room is the one carrying the mop. Margaret Donovan shed her invisibility the moment she shattered that smart glass, and she never put it back on. She didn't just survive the siege. She conquered the estate, and in doing so, she conquered the boss. The Mafia underworld would soon learn to tremble not just at Jasmine's name, but at the heavy, thundering footsteps of the woman who stood beside him, the invisible maid who became the undisputed, blood-soaked queen of the eastern seaboard.